Thank you so much for joining us today. We're very excited to be holding our first Strive Higher in Conversation webinar. So this is a kind of an exciting day for all of us. As I briefly introduce myself and my co-host and our panel, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat if you wish. Tell us where you are. Maybe I'm in London, and tell us what sparked your interest to join us today, just to kind of get an idea of who's in the room. I am Emma Bayne. I'm a principal consultant at Strive Higher. My background is leading transformation and change, both across the sector and in the UK government. I'm a former chief technology officer, and I worked across a range of roles across the spectrum of functions in higher education. I'm deeply passionate about the power of collaboration, about empowerment and empathy, and how you can design this into every aspect of higher education. So just briefly about Strive Higher, who's running this webinar. We are a higher education consultancy, and we work in partnership with higher education institutions, and our work is all about collaborating, listening, and supporting universities and their communities to use all their experience and knowledge to make positive change happen and to shape their future. So today joining me is Ben Rogers, who's co-hosting. He is one of our associate principal consultants and has got bags of experience in HE. He is a former director of registry services and a student president. He has worked in a range of professional services functions in HE and was the former chair of the Academic Registrars Council, known as ARC. He wrote a wonderful insight piece for us on the topic that we're discussing today, the student and university relationship. Apologies if I stumble over any of the job titles and stuff. There's a lot of similar sounding words and things to say. So, Leigh Robinson was meant to be joining us today, but unfortunately she's unwell, so she couldn't make it, which is a real shame. We do send her, all the best. But we do still have with us Jo Coward, who is the current academic registrar and executive director of student academic administration at the University of Hertfordshire, and she's also the vice chair of the Academic Registrars Council. And we've got Simon Varwell, who is the director of student engagement and representation at the Highland and Island Student Association. Phew, that bit's done. Thank you so much for joining us today, both of you, and sharing all your experiences and insights from all the work you've done and all the roles you've held across the sector. So finally, in this preamble, on this webinar today, we want to hear your thoughts and questions. So please add your questions and thoughts into the chat, into the Q&A. And so first, we're just going to have a conversation, and then we'll answer as many questions as we can. So now I will hand over to Ben for the first question.
Thank you, Emma. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, so a bit of this conversation came about because of the article that I wrote, that if you hadn't had the chance to read it yet, we can either publish it in the chat just now, or it's on the Strive Higher website if you want to go and have a look and a read of it. And many thanks to Jo and Simon for joining us today. So as you both know me relatively quite well, I'll open with a bit of a cheeky question, as I tend to do in these environments, is one of the terminologies that's been thrown about for a long time is students as customers. So maybe start with you, Jo. What do you think that terminology is right? Do you think it's ever been right? Do you think it's wrong?
I can absolutely see why it was used, particularly with the changing nature of the relationship between universities and their students in contractual terms. So you could see that, but I've never thought that our relationship with students is, if you're a customer, there's a transactional nature to the relationship, is it? So, for example, if I'm a customer and I go to John Lewis, let's say, I exchange currency for a product, there's a transaction there. Whereas I think for students, there's not an expectation that just by paying your fees, then you buy a degree or an award of some kind. So it's not transactional in that sense. So I've always thought, and I have used the term, and confess up, used the term myself, but it's always felt quite clunky, never felt quite right. For me, there's much more of a transformational relationship, I think. We give students these amazing, we hope, opportunities to not only develop academically, also get their skills, to open them to new experiences, to meet perhaps a whole different range of people that perhaps they would have done ordinarily, and that then hopefully would lead to a fulfilling and rewarding career and life. So it's never felt for me quite right. Although I think what it has done, if I put a slight positive spin on it, I think what it has helped is improve the kind of standards of service that we provide to students. If I think, this is where I start to feel slightly ancient, I think very early in my career, it wasn't unknown for classes to be cancelled, and the classes were just cancelled and they weren't replaced or repeated or so on. Whereas now, there are unforeseen circumstances where perhaps classes are cancelled, but everyone, you know how many, hours, teaching hours and so on that's expected. So universities put classes on, they're replaced and so on. I'll just use that as an example. So it has driven service standards, but I just never felt quite confident that it really replicated what our relationship was or should be with students.
Yeah. Thanks, Joe. I think that's really interesting. I mean, I suppose it's confession time. I've known Simon for a very long time, from when we were in the student movement together. So I think I know what your answer is going to be, Simon. But let's see if I'm right around this one. What do you think about students as customers?
Yes, indeed, Ben. Thanks for kind of saying that we've known each other for a long time. That makes it easy for me to confess that I'm old enough to remember when in Scotland we first built student engagement into our, at the time, just university quality arrangements in the early noughties. That's been a seminal change for us in terms of thinking about students in a much more participative way. I mean, yes, on a very, very basic transactional level, you are the customer, but I think we make a serious mistake if we make that the biggest or the only aspect of it. One of the metaphors used by, or comparisons used by people at the time in Scotland, and I've heard this multiple times, so I don't think I can ever attribute it to anyone authoritatively, is about comparing your learning in education to either going to a restaurant or going to the gym. Now, if you go to a restaurant and you get a bad service, you're entitled to, be disgruntled. You're entitled to complain, and there's not too many responsibilities on you as a customer in a restaurant, other than some basic behaviours in terms of, kind of behaving in a decent public way. But beyond that, there's not too much on you. If you go into a gym and slap some money on the counter and say, make me fit, it's not going to work. So actually, you're going to have to work at the gym in the way that you don't work at the restaurant as a paying customer. And so obviously, you're still a customer of the gym. You're entitled to give feedback at the gym and say, well, actually, it would be great if we could have this equipment, or I'd like more space to do that. That's absolutely fair enough. And you may have a role to play in coming up with good ideas, just as if you make the same suggestion in a restaurant. It would be nice if the lighting was lower or the fish was a bit warmer, etc., etc. But what you can't do is then leave it at that. If you want a successful experience at the gym, you're going to have to work hard. You're going to have to be honest. You're going to have to kind of put the hours in. You're going to have to put the grunt in. You're going to have to be honest with people about your expectations and your ambitions. If you're using a personal trainer, that personal trainer deserves some honesty and some fullness from you. So it's about that depth of engagement that makes it very different. So yes, there may be some things that you will purchase as a consumer, but that is by no means the definitive or biggest part of your identity with the institution. It's much, much more participative than that.
Thank you, Joe. I'm delighted both of you used food so far at lunchtime as as examples for students as customers. I mean, I think just maybe taking it on a level a little bit and thinking, the article was more about making students as partners. So what if we are to make students true partners, or that's a motion of how we are going, what sort of upskilling do you think that student officers might need to become more like partners for universities? And to be frank about it, is there any upskilling that university leaders might need to embrace students in that view as well? And I'll go to Simon first on that provocation.
Yeah, so going back again in time to the time when the Scottish sector put student engagement at the heart of our quality arrangements, that was the time that Sparks was founded. So I think most people in the room will hopefully know a little bit about Sparks, student partnerships in Quality Scotland, the national agency for student engagement. And basically, when we agreed as a sector that we were going to have student engagement as a driver and a focus in our sector, it was agreed that there ought to be a little bit of capacity building and some muscle behind that to help institutions make that happen. And I spent 16 years at Sparks up until 2 years ago, and so I can remember the history of that. Basically, Sparks started out doing two things. Yes, it went out there building capacity among students, and I can talk later about some of the key elements of that capacity in terms of how do you gather and give good, meaningful feedback. But actually, it became very, very clear that there was also development to be done with staff as well, if for no other reason than to demystify the role of the student rep. We're training some student reps over here. This is what we're telling them. And you can then draw staff immediately into a conversation about, okay, are those student reps doing things that the training tells them to do? Are they giving you feedback that is useful? How do you reflect on that? How do you engage with them? So there's actually one of my favourite things to do actually in Sparks over the years was that staff development element with staff. Now, of course, we have to be sympathetic with staff, and I suppose we have to be very sympathetic with students. Everyone's busy. Everyone's got lots to do. So to kind of put student engagement sort of onto the shoulders of staff who are groaning under the weight of all sorts of commitments can be tough. But I always enjoyed explaining and selling student engagement to staff as something that should be useful. It should be something that should benefit them. And if I can use the customer term in a slightly perverse way, we could say that teaching staff are the first customers of a good student representative. Because if a student representative does their job in terms of giving good feedback, the first thing that should happen is that academic staff learn something, or they get evidence they didn't already know, or they get extra weight to help make an argument that they were already wanting to make. So actually, academic staff should benefit and have their work almost easier for having a good body of student evidence behind them to point them towards what would really enhance learning.
Thank you. Jo?
I do think we've got a lot to learn from the Scottish model, actually, in the wider parts of the UK. And I think there were lots of experience that I think would be beneficial for us, to as I say, to learn from. I think there's two aspects to this. So I think in terms of student unions and student leaders, I think we have an obligation to help them help us. So is exactly, that is about enabling them to understand some of the terminology and language that we love to use in HE, just to try and demystify some of that. I think for student unions in particular, the challenge is always, how do we ensure that we represent the whole of our student body? And I think that increasingly is ever more challenging, because the student body now is increasingly diverse, and different groups of students interact with their institution in many and varied ways that we're only just starting to understand. It's almost like we need a sociological model of different names of different groups of students, because in that way both we and student unions start to understand their needs, and then how we then can support their engagement So I think there's definitely a piece of work to be done there. I think also for us as university leaders, I think the temptation is always to allow space for student leaders to say things in meetings and so on, but we're not always very good at hearing what they're actually trying to say to us. And I think we have to make sure we create that space and that opportunity. And it's funny, I was just reflecting before I joined this webinar. You start to think about what in your career, what were the things that you used to do, or things that you could have done better. And I recall at a previous institution, I used to spend a lot of time with our students' union because it was such a wealth of knowledge and experience. And there's two things that came to mind if I could have a moment for a couple of anecdotes. So the first one was around module choice. So we believed in student choice, and so we had this vast array of modules that students could choose from, because that was the thing. Students could curate their own program that met their own particular needs. But what we found is only a small percentage of students would actually choose modules that, the kind of elective style module. And when we went to ask them, why aren't you filling the forms in? Why aren't you choosing your modules? And this is what always sticks with me. They said, because you give us the illusion of choice. You have all this choice, but then you cancel them all because there aren't enough students to run. And there we were thinking we were delivering something that students wanted, but we weren't at all, and for me that was just a real salutary moment. And it just, if we'd listened and heard and actually spoken to students when we were designing our curriculum, we might not have designed it as we had. So I do think it's our responsibility to listen and hear. And my second anecdote was around I've forgotten what it was now. Sorry, carry on. I'll come back to it. I don't. I'm driven my dog. Sorry, apologies. You can edit that out later.
No problem. For a price, Joe, no problem at all. That's absolutely fine to do that. I didn't tell you that bit beforehand. Simon, can I just say, in the chat, you're getting a lot of positivity around your gym comment, which is impressive.
Yes, I don't go to the gym. I should clarify that. Yeah, much more of a go for a long walk kind of person.
But it is interesting. We'll maybe come back to a few of the comments that I've made there in a minute by Emma. But I think one thing that I just want to turn it round to a little bit, and it was for those of you who were at the Academic Registrars conference last week or the week before, Pamela Gillis came and gave a sort of keynote address about something, about the governance failings at Dundee University. But one thing that she touched on a different session, Joe, you might have even chaired the session, thinking about it now, was that during COVID, she brought the student union president round the executive table at Glasgow Caledonian University, and she felt that was a really powerful thing to have done, to actually then be talking directly to the students, having them round the table. And she did use the word partnership in what she said back there. And I thought that was quite powerful. And again, I'm conscious I don't want to make this a fully Scottish thing, since 50% of the people on the screen are Scottish. But of course, in Scots law, it's written in that 10% of the academic board, senate, whatever you call it in your institution, has to be made up of student representation. So is it that Scotland, I might come to you first, Joe, rather than Simon, because you might just say yes back to this. Is it that Scotland have got this right? Is it that Scotland is slightly ahead? And is this the direction you think the rest of the UK might go in?
Well, just I remember, because I did chair that session, and I think Pamela's what an amazing woman she is. I mean, phenomenal. And when I did use the word customer, if you recall, and got told off in the nicest possible way. And you're right, she was very, very strong on genuine and real partnership. But what she went on to say, which which is something broader, but I think it is also relevant here, and it speaks to your question. She talked about competence and culture. So you can have, and I think she kind of hit on something here, where you can have members of board. You can say 10% of your board are student leaders, student representatives, and so on. But have you created a culture where their input is meaningful and that they feel they can speak truth to power? Although, because if it's a genuine partnership, they are part of that power as well. And I think she hit on that, and I think for me that was such a really important point, that otherwise it can be tokenistic, and I think it's something that we really have to think about. It is, my institution, I'm sure lots of institutions from people on this webinar have student members on their governing bodies, their academic board, and we certainly do. And the focus is always on, are we hearing them? Are we listening to them? Are they able to make a meaningful contribution? And having remembered the bit that I was forgotten just a moment ago was, one of the things I used to do in a previous institution, before meetings like academic board and so on, I would meet with the student reps on that board and the student union representatives, and we'd go through all the papers, but very clearly in a neutral way, so they understood the context, what was being discussed, what the likely outcomes could be, and then we would just leave them for them privately then to talk about how they would input, what their views were, and so on. And they found it really helpful, and I think we found it really helpful because they made a meaningful contribution, and we made decisions, correct decisions that benefited the institution. I don't think otherwise we would have done. So I think there's much to learn, but I think we have to create that culture and provide that support so students can make up, it's a genuine partnership. It's not, as you write, it's not tokenistic. And I think there's a way to go there. And I think as the student body is changing and as the higher education landscape is changing, instruction of the LLE and so on, that's going to be ever more difficult and challenging. But if we're serious about it, I think we can work collaboratively together to actually find a way, move a way forward.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think I said when I joined this call to Emma that I didn't like talking about myself, and I really don't, but I'm going to talk about myself for literally 2 seconds here. But I was actually the student president when Pamela started at Glasgow Caledonian, and every word she said about how she engaged with student unions is 100% true.
Yeah.
And that's something that I've tried to keep through my career. I did have an open door to her where I was student president. I could just ask her anything, and there was no judgment. There was nothing there. She just answered it back correctly. And that's something that I've tried to take with me throughout my career. I also see that Will Fuller's on the call on the conversation just now from Cardiff Met. And hopefully he'll agree, or he'll put in the comments that he doesn't agree, which is my worry because he likes to take the mickey out of me at times. But there was always an open door from me when I was Director of Registrar at Cardiff Met. The student officers could come and ask me anything, and there was no judgment on anything around it. It was nothing that they couldn't ask me. And I think that was quite a powerful tool about building up trust with the student union. And I've got the 3 dots from Will in the chat there that's making me really nervous. So I'm gonna quickly go and pass to Simon so I can delete his comment if
the truth is going to come out, Ben.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, and fully agree with everything you say, Joe. Culture is absolutely crucial. Now, yes, we do have, and we're delighted about and very proud of the fact that 10% of our senates or academic boards are students. But actually, if the 90% wanted to make life difficult for those students, they could do so. No, they don't. But theoretically, if you want to bully and harangue and ostracize 10% of people on your committee, it's not difficult to do so. And I would actually say that you could still do that at 50-50 as well. If you get a room full of senior, experienced academic leaders and some students, the power dynamic will still be pro-staff. In fact, I would actually go as far to say that you could have 10% in staff and they'd still dominate the room. Not out of any kind of malice, but just because they have lots to say and lots of wisdom to give and lots of things to answer for. So it really does take that cultural shift. And one of the most difficult things to do, if you're particularly the more senior you are, is to relinquish that power and to relinquish that clutch on the ability to make quick decisions. And thinking back to the pandemic, Ben, you talked about how student presidents being put onto the kind of the executive management group, which is absolutely fabulous. And I've heard of other examples of also the CEO of the Students' Association being on there as well, in order to give that kind of resource and capacity side of things from the student union. But I did some research through the pandemic as a result of my master's into what student engagement looked like during the pandemic, and I found that there was some really good stuff like what you referred to, Ben, and some really terrible stuff where people just didn't. And what for me, it largely came down to the instinct. Would your instinct have been to engage them in peacetime as well? So I'm just putting a link into an article I wrote where I looked at a tool called Arnstein's Ladder of Citizen Participation, which I'm a total geek of, and I tried to look at it through the prism of the pandemic, and basically the highest and lowest levels of engagement were all visible during the pandemic, which was a shame on one level, but also reassuring that those high levels were in there as well. So yeah, I would just say that it really does come down to culture, and it really does come down to the instinct, and so that then raises questions about what are the leadership qualities that we're looking for, and how do we define leadership, and how do we weave that into things like executive training programs and career advancement? To what extent do you progress through the academic structures and the management structures because you've got evidence of your engagement and your partnership working?
Yeah, no, that's really, really powerful, Simon. Really, I mean, I guess you can't really go through an in conversation at the moment without touching a little bit on the financial position of universities. But rather than sort of say how difficult it's really, do you think it might actually help strengthen student partnerships if students actually understood why some of the decisions are being made and can actually influence some of the decisions and say, do you know what, you don't need to worry about that. Students aren't that bothered about that, but it would be great if you did this. Simon, do you think?
It actually, yes. I mean, on one level, it's difficult to partnership can be scary because on one level it can slow down your decisions, and it can, let's be blunt, demand resource. If you're going to kind of pay more reps to be in the room, if you're going to provide more training, yes, there's a resource implication. But I would argue that there's actually a resource implication for not engaging them and actually picking up the pieces later. Can be time consuming, it can be fiddly, you get complaints, and so actually to be able to, it's a terrible waste of managers' time to have to kind of justify a decision retrospectively or to deal with a complaint about something. So if you invest that same resource earlier, then and be in a space where you can ask students, what do you think? Now, to some extent, we're limited here because we've got a very limited time scale, or certain options are off the table for the following reasons, but within certain parameters, what do you think? That can be much more powerful, and it helps draw those students in. And I would just make one other kind of comment about that, which is that let's not forget what we're training our students to do. We're training them to be the workforce of the future. We're training them to be the leaders and the managers of the future. And let's be frank, the world is terrifying. I don't know if anyone else agrees with me, but the world is absolutely terrifying. And, we're in this situation that we probably haven't had for, a couple of generations, that the next generation is almost inheriting a worse world than people in their 40s like me inherited. And so their job of picking up the mess we've left them is a very, very tough one. So if we're training them to kind of deal with the wicked problems of the world, why can't we involve them in solving the wicked problems of the institution? Because A, it will train them for their real world difficulties, but B, they might just have some good ideas. They might just tell us some useful things. You know, it's not a therapeutic process. It's not just going through the motions. They genuinely might reveal some new insights, because let's face it, our student population is more diverse than ever. In some ways, they're more politicized than ever. They're certainly more politically savvy in terms of, you know, the world of social media and communication and cultural engagement than ever. So actually, they may deliver some really good answers. And here's a controversial thing. What's wrong with telling students that we have a high bar for their answers? What's wrong with telling them that we expect really good quality, realistic, partnered evidence? Because I don't think pushing students on that while giving them the freedom to give those answers is an unfair thing to do.
Thank you. Jo?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think the nuance I would put, I think we would all recognise there are times when some issues have got a level of sensitivity that is often difficult to share at particular moments. Notwithstanding that, I think, you know, back to our culture question, if you operate and work in a spirit of openness and transparency, bringing students into that conversation, actually, it's a bit like if you get all the right voices in the room, you make better decisions. And knowing that the student body is absolutely, we all agree that it's a very different student body than perhaps it was even 5 years ago. And part of this webinar was to think about what this might look like in 2030. And I was thinking how far, sometimes you think, oh, that's years away. But we're recruiting students now who will graduate in 2030. So it's not that far away. So having that diverse group of students in the room, making it clear we are looking to them to truly represent the student body, and I think that's important, that will enable us collectively to make informed business decisions. Now, we may at some points have to agree to disagree, and there's that conversation to be had. But if you treat people that they're the grown-ups, we're all grown-ups in the room, and sometimes difficult decisions have to be made. Sometimes better decisions will be made as a result of people being in the room, but it's always better to have people in the room to understand. And I'm sure universities on this call are dealing with the fallout of when that hasn't happened. And absolutely, it's so hard to retrospectively explain why you came to that decision. And then if you have to row back because you get information that you wish you had, that just undermines your position anyway. So, let's be grown-ups, have people in the room, make the best business decisions, recognising that there will be moments where sensitivities around staffing and so on has to be talked about, perhaps in a more confidential way. But get the grown-ups. That's what they are. That's what they're going into the world to be. Why wouldn't you have that grown-up conversation?
Brilliant, and of course you put the horror back in my head that I remember when I wrote this article, because I wrote the article 2030. That sounds a long way off, and then you realise it's really not that far off now.
Just round the corner.
Just round the corner. I still remember the horror of when I realised students were joining who were born after 2000 were now coming through. I was like, oh no, this isn't happening. But I suppose a little bit, sort of the final point from me before I hand over to Emma, is probably a little bit around what role do you think student unions will play by 2030? Do you think it will change anything? Do you think it'll be the same? Do you think it will move? Maybe I'll go to you, Jo, a little bit around that. What role do you think student unions might have?
I think it is likely to change, and I think students' unions are already talking about this themselves. Again, it's not to repeat ourselves, because the student body is changing, the needs of students are changing. So, making sure they are able to represent their students on university groups and so on. But also, let's not forget, they provide a range of valuable support services to students, and they want to make sure that they continue to do that in a way that is meaningful and supports students. So absolutely, I think they're having that conversation already, and I think it's incumbent on us as university leaders to be part of that conversation, to have that conversation inform our discussions around student representation. How do we make sure we're all committed to the student voice, but how that then actually is in reality in each of our institutions? I think it's something that is evolving, and we have to be open to changes. The student body, when I was a student and a lowly student rep on my course, that was a very different role than I think students have now, and rightly so. So I think we're just going to be working this through together.
Thank you. Simon?
I have a mixture of optimism and pessimism on that question in terms of the future role that student unions can play. I think, again, to draw on the Scottish example, we've kind of updated our quality regulations again in the last couple of years. Regulations makes it sound very austere. The process, the framework. It is austere too, though. No, it isn't. The point I made, yeah, what was my point there? Yes, I suppose that we've done a couple of changes in Scotland. One is that we're now in a tertiary framework, which is really, really helpful in terms of the conversations we get across universities and colleges. The other one is that we've again increased our sort of language, strengthened our language around student partnership now. We're kind of evolving from student engagement to student partnership. So the opportunities for students' associations and unions to get involved in deep conversations about quality at an often quite technical but very exciting engine room level and at the national level is increased, and that's really, really good. And I think that's a reflection of the trust that Scotland has for its students' associations. And again, we do disagree, and as Joe was talking about, we're all grown ups, and we can all disagree with each other. And one of the best definitions I ever heard of partnership was the ability to disagree well. So I think we're trying to embody that in Scotland. So that optimism in terms of the respect that associations have and the way they're getting involved in the exciting changes we've had in quality is my positive answer. My negative answer is that the terrible financial decisions that are having to be made by institutions will soon filter down to student unions. I think politically, a lot of universities will resist cutting their student union budget until the very last opportunity. But unfortunately, it's going to happen in a lot of places, and that will lead to things like cuts in staff and the policy capacity within students' associations, and potentially the resourcing for officers. So, in one sense, the demand, or very reasonable demand and expectation on student unions to get involved in important topics, often very existential topics, as we're talking about the future of entire subject areas and departments, and even the very existence of institutions is up for grabs, but the capacity is going to be extremely tight. So again, that comes back to us, I suppose, having to make some very realistic conversations. Maybe some things are going to be lost, maybe some things are going to be cut, but what within that is the priority. So some difficult conversations lie ahead for student unions, but if they're in the room, it's better that we're talking with them rather than about them.
Brilliant, thank you. In that case, I'll hand over to Emma for the sort of closing questions and round up.
Thank you, Ben. Yes, I wanted to ask a question around, I was just, as you were talking, and I mean, there's so much amazing stuff that you've covered in that discussion. I was thinking about a lot of student feedback and thinking sits on digital platforms outside of the university's remit. So you've got a lot of stuff on social media. You have a lot of kind of students bring together groups to represent their communities, and there's lots of thinking and thoughts in there around change that they want, and that all of that doesn't sit within the kind of ecosystem of the university, and it's not part of the data and part of the kind of information that you have. Is there any kind of thinking about the future, anything that universities can do to embrace this data, this information out there, to kind of feed and support their agenda and to bring the student voice more to the forefront. I don't know if you've got any thoughts about that, maybe Joe?
Gosh, that's a massive question, Emma.
Sorry. just a few thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah, no. It's often a challenge, isn't it? I think with any kind of student feedback, wherever, that you gather as much as the questions you ask, in a sense, and that's often limited. So I was listening to a student union president earlier this week talk about, well, we fill in our module surveys, but there were lots of other things that we wanted to say, but there was no space to say those things, so there was limited. So you could see the university was missing such potential rich data information that potentially missed out on. And the only thing I'm mindful about forums outside of universities is how can we legitimately gather that information without breaching privacy, GDPR rules, and be seen as though we're kind of overly monitoring what students say. I think if students are saying things about what they want to change outside of university, it says to me that we haven't got the right channels inside universities. So that's what I would want to ask our students. Well, why are you going there? What are we missing? Equally, and my colleagues know I've said this numerous times internally, data does not tell you what you should do. So it's not like a crystal ball that you suddenly have all this data, all these feedback, and you look at it and it suddenly tells you what to do. It gives you the starting point. And then for me, it's around the discussion and further iterations. It's an evidence, but it's not the be all and end all. And so for me, I think it's around, again, perhaps it's back to that culture and those communication channels. What haven't we got that we need to enable us to have the fullest picture possible of what our students think and feel and want and need? And that's probably for me the direction of travel.
That's great, thank you.
I would agree, Joe, and I suppose for me that comes down to the difference between providing information and providing analysis. I think we ask students a lot. Sometimes if we ask students how they feel about being surveyed, they'll tell us, those that respond, that they're being over surveyed, and so there's a lot of questions to ask about actually how we make the most of those processes to make them more efficient. But actually, what's really important is what then happens to that information. So you learn X and Y and Z from the feedback and the surveys. And I think in terms of those other sources, absolutely things like social media and what have you, that really needs to be kind of brought into a way that is usable. But this is the job you can give to student reps. You can say to student reps, okay, here's the results of the survey. What do you think? What are the priorities? What jumps out? And I don't think you can get this. I have to say, out of AI. I don't think there's an opportunity for AI because of the inbuilt inequalities in there. So I'm very, very sorry. I need to disagree with Suhasini there. But what you can get and that you can't replace is the inquisitiveness and the knowledge and the life experience from a student. So a student can, a rep, someone sitting in the analysis space can say, right, okay, yeah, so 80% of people chose that option. This is why. This is what I'm hearing in the white noise. This is what I'm hearing in the corridors and the WhatsApp groups and the chats with my friends. And these are the kind of anecdotes that can bring it to life. So it's in, and actually they can then challenge the institution with further questions about what's happening. So I think it's really important that we don't just have the data, but we also have the insight, the anecdote, and the argument. And you can get all of those things from students in a very, very powerful way.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Simon. That's wonderful. And fortunately, we've been looking at all of the chat and kind of responding to questions as we go, because we're kind of getting to the point where we're running out of time. So thank you for all of that. There's been loads of great conversation there in the chat. One last closing question from me is around, if you could think of one kind of positive change that you would like to see in this space, that so that we could move towards this kind of brighter future for 2030, what would that be, Jo?
Gosh, we could have a whole webinar on that question.
You can only pick one though. There you go. See.
Well, I think it would be around culture and governance. I think governance it is worst case scenario is a set of committees that are connected that lead up to something. For me, where it works best is where it is the living organism of a university, that you can actually see the debate, the genuine debate that goes on. And I think if we were going to have something more positive, to make sure that every institution is open and is ready to hear perhaps difficult messages, but also to kind of act and to be seen to be acting in that genuine partnership way. And I think we've got governance structures that are mature enough now to be more open to that and withstand that kind of discussion and say debate. So that, for me, I think that's one of the things that I would really like to see.
Yeah, that's great. Simon?
And I would add, I'll try to end optimistically. I would add celebrating the successes that are out there.
Yeah.
I think we're not very good as a sector at celebrating our successes, particularly, one risk of a kind of process of continual enhancement and continual cuts is that you're never allowed to stand still for 5 seconds and celebrate the great work that you have done. And that's not just a morale booster, it's also very important for communicating back to students about the improvements that have been made, especially the improvements that have been made as a result of student feedback. So students sometimes see something change but don't necessarily attribute it to the survey they filled out last year, or the email they sent to their class rep last year, or the complaint they made to a member of staff. And so that's really, really important. And that's especially, if you've got people coming through for, 1, 2, or 3 years or not very many years of study, you sometimes walk in and you don't quite realize that, the fabulous building that you're studying was only built last year, and that was only that only happened as a result of 5 years of hard work and lots of feedback. So I think in equipping and empowering students to realise and to understand what their voice has changed is helpful. And so I'm a big fan of when you're offering an opportunity, putting out a survey, say to people, the last time this happened, A, B, and C changed as a result.
Really good point. Really good point.
Yeah, there's something really interesting also about telling people, if you're not doing something that they've maybe asked for, why you're not doing it as well, and being open about that, and doing kind of activities like you said we did, and publishing them for students so they can see what feedback's coming, what you've looked at, why you've changed it, why you maybe haven't adopted stuff, because it's maybe there's lots of valid reasons for not doing stuff as well as doing stuff. So yeah, it's just really that transparency makes a real difference to people understanding what they're coming into and what's available to them, and where their voice can be heard and can resonate and really affect change. Okay, thank you very much. This has been wonderful. We have hit the end of time. Sorry if we've missed any questions. The chat has been going off. It's been amazing. This has been a wonderful session. We deeply and really appreciate Jo and Simon's time. We appreciate the time of all the people that came to watch as well. We will be doing some more of these Zoom conversations, so please watch out for them. Please follow Strive on LinkedIn. Please connect with us, with all of us, and please keep these conversations going. And we'll be doing a kind of write-up of all the thinking and thoughts from this, including the stuff in the chat, and we'll be publishing that and sharing that. So hopefully that will help. And do just reach out if you'd like to talk about any of this stuff. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
I know.
Thank you.